This is Nick Black in Los Angeles, and I'm talking to Geoffrey Wright. Hello, Geoffrey.
Hi.
Thanks for taking time to talk to us, Geoffrey. Firstly, I want to ask you, you're just about to commence your first Hollywood film. Let's get to how you got here in the first place. How did that come about?
Oh, God, it's such a tangled, twisting, turning story. Basically, what happened at early 1996 was that someone at Warner Brothers saw Metal Skin, and I got brought out to work on a project called Speed Racer with Lauren Shuladonna, which had a long and troubled history. There was a couple of good scripts out there. Ultimately, the script I wanted to do, the version that I liked, which was in their archive, and the version which the powers that be liked were in conflict. Just one of those things, and that was that. So then I picked up another script at Warner's called Plastic Man, but that was thwarted by a project which came out sooner. I think it was an Eddie Murphy thing where his body bent and went all different shapes. What was that? I can't remember. I need some help here. Nutty Professor. Thank you. So that was the end of that one, but we started to storyboard Plastic Man, which was actually based on a very old comic that was illustrated by a guy that I think used to draw naked girls for old Playboy magazines or something like that. This gentleman ultimately suicided, so I think I call it the curse of Plastic Man. So that accounted for like 8 months lost on those two projects. Speed Racer is still out there, by the way, and no one's ever tackled it, but I think it's going to be, as the Americans say, a home run. The problem is that the studios like the idea of a project like Speed Racer with, racing cars and clear-cut good guys and bad guys and wacky races and like violent car crashes and things like that. But when they look at the Japanese cartoon on which the project is based, that always sends them into a kind of paralysis. So it's difficult because someone at the studio likes these ideas and these concepts, and then you've got a room full of 40-year-old guys or 45-year-old guys that really look at this stuff and go, well, how could anyone like this? And yet, as we all know, Speed Racer is very popular on the cable scene. And there's a whole generation, I think, people I think around about the age, maybe anything from 25 to 35 are very familiar with it. The Japanese love it, of course. A lot of Americans love it. And I know that perhaps not so many Australians are familiar with it.
ABC.
Yeah, but so that one's still out there. I don't know who will. The fellow that did Revolution, what's that director's name?
Hugh Hudson.
Hugh Hudson, I think, was attached to it at one stage. Some projects are like quicksand. There's some infamous ones, and Speed Racer has been quicksand for a lot of directors. So that accounted for almost half a year. So then I got involved with a project at Fox, a big one called Silver Surfer, based on the comic book character of the same name. Unfortunately, Fox at the time was backing trucks of money, tilting the tray of the truck into a project called Titanic. Never heard of it, right? And they were in no mood to spend money on an $80 million film with an obscure director from the other side of the world. However, I ended up working on that with a writer called Richard Jeffries, and we produced what I thought was a pretty good script. So that is still out there. I think the studio went on to create another $30 million version with some other comedy writers, but that kind of misfired never happened. I knew it would. It's not a project. That character is not one that you can poke some fun at that character, but basically it's a very of all those Marvel superheroes, that one has got to be the most philosophical. So of course the studio was in love with the surfboard and his relationships with attractive Earthwomen and his master, the gigantic creature Galactus who destroys New York. And there lay the problem. The destruction of New York was very, very expensive, but it was sure a lot of fun to storyboard it. So that accounted for another 8 months. But that script is still out there, and it's my dream to go back to that script, to go to Bill Mechanic and say, at some point, I think we should resurrect that version because your comedy haha version is just awful, and such would like to play Silver Surfer, and I think this man has got marquee value for you, and like that. But it's not going to be my next project.
It sounds a bit frustrating here until Cherry Falls came along. Would that be correct?
Well, the story doesn't end there. It actually gets worse, because then I went to United Artists and I was working on a project called Supernova, which really brought matters to a head. Supernova was once again a big $70 million sci-fi. All went well. I pitched my take on the material to the UA people Christmas. So there we were in the boardroom. I had my pointer and I was pointing at coloured pictures around. But pictures are good with executives because they get them. They get big pictures. So I was walking around the boardroom, pointing at pictures, getting everyone jazzed up. So I went back to Australia to see my family, and I came back and I picked out my crew and we got into it. And it was wonderful. I had people from NASA. I mean, the one great thing about Hollywood is that it does advance your education across the board. I mean, I'm kind of now an amateur authority on space travel because of my dealings with the Jet Propulsion Lab and NASA and all this kind of stuff, all the massive amounts of research we did. We built a $5 million set down at LAX, and we built something almost as expensive at Raleigh Studios. Unfortunately, our troubles began when an executive discovered, I guess someone told them, that we'd built a set with a curved floor. My DP was Vilmos Zsigmond, who shot some very famous films, including Close Encounters, so he's no stranger to the genre. And he walked into the studio, and wherever I put my camera, it's wonderful! And it was. We had a curved floor, and we put it on a relatively cheap $10,000 gimbal. However, I got a call from one of the executives, and they said, we visited the set the other day. I said, yeah, it's great, isn't it? Well, why is the floor curved? And I said, well, I told you this at Christmas. There is no gravity in outer space, and chambers have to rotate. I said, your studio produced a film called 2001, which dealt with this very problem. It was part of my take to go back and embrace the problems, the physical problems of space travel, not to ignore them like Star Trek, but to embrace them. And hey, it's interesting, but aesthetically, when you embrace those problems, the sets become very interesting. You know, ring up Vilmos, ask him, you know. And, we told, James Spader was attached at that stage, and we told James that he was going to be suspended on wires and bouncing around. You know, when the chambers would stop rotating, he would become weightless, and he loved this idea. But the executive said, well, we don't like them. We think that they're going to be very confusing. And I said, I don't think so. I think everyone understands that there's no gravity in space, and that we'll see the rotating chambers from the outside. And they said, the other thing that bothers us is, why are you building a model? Why aren't you doing the exterior CGI? I said, because I still think that CGI has a problem in reflecting light. You know, you can create nice forms, but we're dealing with objects that are going to be reflecting a lot of naked light in outer space. And I said, some of the best spaceship work I've ever seen is still in 2001, where they used models. So we built a 17-foot-long model, which did survive, by the way. One of my sets didn't, but that model did survive. Approved by James Cameron. He walked past one day and thought it was pretty cool. So that was a nice compliment. So we got over the CGI thing, and I don't like to use CGI unless you absolutely have to. I like to avoid it because it's overused and it's overrated. It's getting better all the time, but it's still not to this. If you look at Anaconda as an illustration, the snake is only ever convincing in filtered light or at night. I mean, kind of convincing. In broad daylight, forget it. It looks like a cartoon. Even some of the overhead shots in Titanic, they may be attractive or pretty, but they're hardly convincing. So this is my problem with CGI, but we got over that. But the curved floor on the spaceship set was, on the Nightingale as they called it, was a big problem. Then we came to a problem of casting. We couldn't agree beyond James Spader who should be in the movie. We had some terrible disputes about that. Terrible. And at that stage of my career, I was prepared to fight. I'd been called into Frank Mancuso's office, and he told me, can you give me a 30-second trailer with this movie? I said, Frank, we're spending a lot of money. If I can't give you 30 seconds of interesting action, we're in big trouble. So he said, great, we're going to have an action movie. That was that. But unfortunately, there are other people involved at the studio, and I think they expected some other kind of movie, which they were used to in their background, which was not science fiction. They didn't appreciate zero gravity, and they didn't appreciate the notion of having kind of like lots of interesting action sequences utilizing zero gravity and so on and so forth. And that was that, and we couldn't agree on the casting. So when I left, we also lost Vincent D'Onofrio and Patricia Arquette. James stayed because it was an important outing for him. He'd never done a film like that before, and we talked about it, but he wanted to stay, and that's fine. Vilmos left, that was that, and the film was taken over by Walter Hill. What happened was that Walter walked into a project where he had his own thoughts about what the script should be. There was my version, there was the studio version, and Walter brought in his version. But if Walter thought that he was going to get away with getting an easy run because he thought that the studio had spent themselves fighting me, then he was wrong because they fought him as well. So it turned into a kind of nightmare, and I think they're still going back for some reshoots of that movie to this day. So ultimately, you realize that in Hollywood, with the studios, they will often, in order to get you, they will even put themselves at a disadvantage. To take a director off a movie like 10 days or 2 weeks before it starts and to expect another director, no matter how talented and experienced, and I saw Southern Comfort again the other night, it's a wonderful film, no matter how talented or experienced that director is, that director has no chance unless he's going to shoot something that he agrees to. And that's, Walter's got to do his own thing, but they didn't want to do his own thing, they wanted him to do their thing. So he came on board, did the best he could, fought with them every day, and I think there were times when people weren't coming out of their trailers for hours on end because they didn't like this or they didn't like that. And it was one of those crazy situations where the pages were coming in as during the shooting days, which is a nightmare. That's death when that happens. It doesn't work out very often. I think in a situation like Casablanca, it worked out beautifully, but that's the exception, obviously. Mostly it leads to a kind of catastrophe. So I was glad to miss all that, and when I realized that I wasn't going to get my way, I guess I was happy that I wasn't there continuing fighting and wasting my time and energy. And that was a big lesson for me. I mean, I fought with the president of the studio. And you don't do that. That's ridiculous. So you learned that you can continue the battle, but not with the frontal assaults. The war goes on, but by other means. You can't be stupid enough to try that. So you realize that not only do you have to grow and learn as a director, you also have to grow and learn in terms of the politics. You have to understand how this place is run politically. That's the bottom line. If you don't learn that lesson, and up until that stage I hadn't, if you don't learn that lesson, you'll constantly be blocked and frustrated, and people may see a value in you as a kind of functionary, as a kind of floor manager, but not as a director, if you're not prepared to fight. Because if you're not prepared to fight, they think, well, that's what he is. Strange thing happens. They don't want you anymore. They don't want you anymore. They only want you if they know you've got a personality. But then the irony is that they have to try and thwart that personality, right? Because their commercial instincts will tell them that perhaps you're overstepping a line, that you're not doing what's best for the movie in terms of box office and things like that. You can debate this because the guys that are kings here, like Cameron or Spielberg or Lucas, they are people whose work is recognizable in the first 20 seconds of a movie. So the notion that you have to destroy a director's personality in order to make them commercial is nonsense. It's just nonsense. But that's what their instincts tell them to do. But of course, if you give in to that, then you'll finish the film, but you may never work again, or B, you'll only work on garbage. So you've got to keep your reputation going, but at the same time not make so many enemies that you'll be wiped out or annihilated in a political battle. So it's a hard balancing act, isn't it?
Well, so for instance, let's say, when you're making Romper Stomper, Phil Victoria, basically the studio in that situation, so they didn't interfere, so what's the difference there?
That's not true. No? I mean, no, there were certain things I couldn't do in Romper Stomper, and there were certain things that got cut out of Romper Stomper. And that's the reality, and I accept that. I mean, if someone's going to give you money, then you're going to have to take certain things on board. I mean, this doesn't come for nothing, and there's no reason why it should. It's not a charity. Quite frankly, I often wonder about director's cuts anyway. I think the so-called director's cut of Lawrence of Arabia, for example, is inferior to the 1962 studio version. I cannot see the point of that re-release. I mean, I'm glad there was a re-release to see a nice print of the movie, but the story is not better. Those little bits and pieces they put in don't make the film better, and there was a good reason why Anne V. Coates cut those moments out. There was a very good reason for that. And when you see them now restored, you think, well, they shouldn't be there. They're just bad. Like the so-called director's cut maybe of The Abyss is really, I don't think it's much of an improvement. It makes the story more comprehensible, but it's awfully long. Maybe the answer to that one is something between what the studio released and what Cameron wanted. But his version is very long. I think directors do need a reality check. Absolutely.
Let's get on to Cherry Falls, which is what you're in pre-production with, and you're very busy with it. Tell us how that came about, Geoffrey. So finally, you're up and away. Can we say that?
Well, you can't really be sure about that until there's film going through the camera. And even then, maybe when the studio's a couple of $1 million in the hole, that's when you think that the momentum is there and they're going to keep going. There's a lot of films, even ones with some very big actors, that get started, and a week into shooting, there was a Shirley MacLaine movie that was stopping and starting. I mean, Shirley MacLaine? You wouldn't think there'd be a problem. So you can't be sure about anything. That's another thing. You have to learn to live with noise and insecurity in Hollywood. You have to learn to live with more stress than you ever imagined possible. If you could combine the task of being like a general with an air traffic controller and perhaps a psychoanalyst, that gives you an idea of what it's like working here. But if you can't handle those kind of stresses, forget it. Just forget it.
So tell us a little bit about Cherry Falls and a little bit about pre-production. What's involved with that? And is the process different to Australia, or is it essentially the same on a bigger level, or what?
No, it's very different, because in Australia there is time to develop projects quietly. A writer and a producer and a director, or some combination of the above, with two or one or two or three of those elements, can develop a project in peace. In this town, basically, you have a first draft. Someone likes it. They pick it up, they buy it, and then they want to go into pre-production. The problem is that you've only got a first draft. You then have to develop and maintain balance in pre-production simultaneously. Now, if you know how hard it is to rewrite or redraft or polish a script at the same time as you're casting, visiting locations, and trying to get everything else together, getting your crew together, that gives you an idea of what you're dealing with. And that's how it is in this town. They try and do two things at once. Whereas in Australia, you're allowed a definite development process which is in peace, and then you shoot the movie with all the noise of shooting a movie. In this town, those things overlap. Especially if a star is on board and they've come on quickly, then there's a panic to get the thing shot, because that star will have other commitments. There's only a certain window. So there's a lot of panic, fear, terror, and greed. I think in that order, in this town.
Cherry Falls, is it an original screenplay? Is it a novel? How you came to it? How they got you interested in it?
Cherry Falls is written by a writer called Ken Selden. My manager showed me the script and thought that I wouldn't like it. And I called her back and I said, any American mainstream movie that ends in a sexual orgy has got to be worth making. So my theory about this script was that if I kept to certain genre notions that would make it fly in the marketplace, I could really get away with murder in a lot of other areas. I've got to be careful with the sex in the movie, because I don't want a rating that's going to exclude too many people. But having said that, if you avoid graphic sex and go for a more sensual approach, then the censor has a much more difficult time in giving you problems, and giving you hassles. Although even there you've got to be careful, because Romper Stomper got banned in certain countries, and when we offered to cut certain things, the censor said, no, there's no particular moments we object to, it's the whole feel of the movie. So you've got to be careful that you don't create this tone which is going to drive people nuts as well. So if you're going to avoid that kind of tone, whatever that tone is, in sexual terms rather than violence on this occasion, because it's not Romper Stomper, it's Cherry Falls. And if you can avoid overly graphic moments, then you can do a lot of interesting things, because we're at a time where there's a change out there, there's something happening. The old approach, like Warner Brothers, for example, were leading the way back in the late 80s and early 90s with those kind of overproduced, horrible, kind of like post-Batman kind of trumped-up things, the big circuses, you know, the Bruce Willises and those kind of movies and all that stuff. They're not, no, I don't want to pick on Bruce Willis, but those kind of, the post-Batman kind of Warner's thing, just a big schmozzle. Those kind of movies don't work anymore. And like Adam Sandler comes out with something called The Waterboy and makes more money than Brad Pitt in Meet Joe Black. So all of a sudden people realize that what is out there, what is actually going on, what's going to be best. And there is an admission that you don't have to overproduce a movie to make a lot of money. So that's changing. The other thing that's changing is that you can really get away with a lot more in terms of what you can have young characters doing in relationships and things like that. Much more. If you look at films from 10 years ago, you can really see the difference. I mean, I have a film in Cherry Falls where I've got a killer hell-bent on revenge against a town. So he's murdering kids, and the kids are indulging in all sorts of sexual practices, and I'm allowed to do this. 10 years ago, this would have been some kind of weirdo art house film. Now, I'm in the mainstream. That's interesting. It also means that someone's going to put some serious money in the promotion of the film, which is always very important. You can make a great movie, but if no one spends money on the promotion, it just goes down and becomes an interesting addition to the archives at Rocket Video or something like that.
This is for a studio, is that right?
This is for October Films, a division of October Films called Rogue Pictures. And of course, October Films has a relationship with Universal, which is interesting because one of my surviving projects, The Sparrow, is also with Universal. So it's funny that I'm still kind of connected vaguely. Universal's had a hard time. I hope they can turn themselves around.
When you remake Psycho,
that was kind of like really putting a gun to your head. I really don't understand the logic of that, and I thought it was an arrogant, thoughtless move. Really kind of misguided. There was no chance with that, because remaking a classic, they must have had holes in their heads. You know, why not remake Citizen Kane? Let's do it in colour this time. Get Brad Pitt to be Charles Foster Kane. You know, it's ridiculous.
The process is quite different than back in Australia for Metal Skin.
Well, you see, everything here is about one thing: money. That's all the money people care about is money. You can, I mean, we talk about the history of film, and we talk about our favourite films, and we get nostalgic about certain films, or Phil Brophy gives a talk about the use of sound and heat, and we look at films in a very kind of insulated and serious way. This town does not care for that kind of thinking. They may as well be producing, it could be Chrysler producing some kind of like family van or something, or it could be a company that produces Tupperware. There is no difference in the mentality. The difficult part of it is that there's no science to it, really. Every time someone thinks they've got it nailed about what is a consistent formula, the public starts becoming interested in something else, or the political situation in the world changes so that people aren't interested in Vietnam War movies anymore, or they're not interested in AIDS movies, or they're not interested in romantic comedies this particular season, but they maybe again in 6 months, that kind of thing. It's constantly, the ground is constantly shifting and you can't nail it. It's just too complicated a model for them to get their hands on. Therefore, this is not a problem for the left side of the brain. It's a problem for the right side of the brain, the intuitive part, and that's what the money people don't have. They have no right side of their brain. There's only the left. So they rely on these rather unfortunate, difficult people called actors and writers and some producers who are headstrong, have instincts and obsessions and dreams, and they're the ones that produce the material that they have to kind of put out there in the marketplace. So basically these creative people make the life of the accountants kind of hellish, and of course vice versa, but they can't function without each other, and that's what makes the business so interesting. It also is what makes it so diabolical, and that's why it's different actually to building cars in Detroit or anything like that. And yet, like I said, these accountants would work in the car industry if it was as lucrative, but as we all know, American cars suck, and American films are still pretty good. By and large, often.
For instance, here you're going to start shooting. Is one of the bean counters is coming up to you and saying, "No, Mr. Wright, we can't do something like that"? I mean, is there a lot of pressure there?
Yeah, but you impose it yourself after a while, because I've wiped stunts out of the script because I know it's going to take us 2 days. And we don't have that. We've got a very particular, limited schedule. We have to stick to it. Otherwise, I get a reputation as some guy that can't stick to a schedule, and that goes against me in the long term. Someone might think that the material, the day-to-day stuff is so good that they want to give me the extra days. But I can't count on that. So I'm going to make sure that we can shoot that script in 40 days. So, yeah, they're often prepared to spend more money to nail a cast breakage, right? But they keep telling you, just because we're spending more money on the cast doesn't mean that we're going to spend more money on the production. And basically, they're all like that. Whether it's a $15 million film or a $70 million film, although, of course, on a $70 million film, it's very easy to start going down a slippery slope. And they usually do.
You're shooting here, or is it a location, studio? What exactly?
I'm shooting in Virginia, in a town called Warrenton and Richmond. It's great to get out of, anything to get out of LA. Anything. Any excuse.
You've obviously been there and had a look.
Yes. Yeah, the South is interesting because it's the New South. It's not exactly like In the Heat of the Night with Sidney Poitier. It's kind of different now. I mean, like, there's still a lot of tensions there, but you watch TV there, it's filled with stories and documentaries about, you know, racial tolerance and the bitter past of the Klansmen and all that kind of stuff. And of course, there's a lot of money now in the South because of the banking. A lot of towns are boom towns because all the growth is in the banks, and the banks are down south in Atlanta and places like that, in those centers. And where money pours in, prejudice begins to drop away. It's very interesting that if you suck the money out of a region, that's when the tensions build up. But if you pump money in, that's when race is, strangely, no longer that important. That's an interesting lesson.
Okay then, Geoffrey, well, we better leave it there. Good luck with Cherry Falls, and hopefully you'll come down to Australia, and when it gets released, you'll talk to us and talk all about it. Geoffrey Wright, all the best.
Thanks.